This is the Comics Alternative Kickstarter, discovering the 2018 releases from Kilgore Books and Comics. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Kickstarter. I'm Derek, and this is the weekly show devoted to comics-related projects that you can find on Kickstarter. And on this week's episode, I have the pleasure of talking once again with Dan Stafford. He is the publisher of Kilgore Books and Comics. Dan, hey, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Derek. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Now, I said having you back on the show. I think this is the first occasion on our weekly Kickstarter series that I'm talking to a Kickstarter creator whom I've spoken with in the past and whose books I'm extremely familiar with. So congratulations for being a first.
Hey, that's great. That'll make it a lot easier.
Yeah. And we should mention to our listeners, or for our listeners, that you're currently at a cafe.
I am. I live in College Park, Maryland, where the University of Maryland is, and they have this really great coffee shop here. I'm going to do a quick plug for them because they're awesome. It's called Board and Brew, and it's a coffee shop where you can rent board games, and so it's a really good, I don't know, it's just like a fun little meeting place that's different than Starbucks. And so usually it's packed with young people doing, tons of different games, but today it's just me and a couple folks studying, so hopefully it won't be too loud.
Well, that's good. No, it sets the stage. It gives a sense of ambiance to our conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk with you about your latest Kickstarter campaign for Kilgore Books and Comics. Now, this isn't the first one that you've done. I know that in 2016 and then last year, you also did a Kickstarter for Kilgore. And so are you basically doing something very similar this time around?
Yeah, and in fact, I did one before that too. When we produced the John Porcellino documentary called Root Hog or Die a few years ago, and so that was my first experience with Kickstarter. Was raising the funds for that. But yeah, I think we're into the cycle that a lot of the other micro presses are in, where we sort of do an annual Kickstarter campaign to sort of fund all our projects for the year. I know that. JT Yost up at Birdcage Bottom has done it, and I know that the folks at Retrofit are doing it, and 2D Cloud always does a great Kickstarter, and Beehive Books, Josh O'Neill, and those guys are doing a lot of good stuff through Kickstarter. So it seems to be kind of the norm for micro presses.
And in fact, many, if not all of those guys, are people that I've had on the Comics Alternative, either the Kickstarter series or on a regular review episode.
Yeah, exactly. You've been a good friend to the small press, so we appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate hearing that, because the small press is basically our bread and butter in terms of content. It's what we gravitate toward. And so when you contacted me, I guess about 2, maybe 3 weeks ago, about the upcoming Kilgore campaign, and you did, not because I do the weekly Kickstarter series, but because I backed you last year, and so I was on your mailing list. So when I saw, hey, you're doing something this year, I want to have you on the Kickstarter show.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate it. It's a big help. That's the biggest challenge with these things, is getting the word out, because it's a pretty non-traditional way to do distribution. So.
Now, listeners of the Comics Alternative should recognize Kilgore Books and Comics, because we talk about your stuff all the time. And I think a year and a half ago, we did that publisher spotlight on the seasonal Kilgore books that you had out. And I even talked with you for that show. Yeah. But for those lame listeners who are not yet hep to Kilgore Books, why don't you introduce what Kilgore is all about, and then tell us specifically what this latest Kickstarter campaign is?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. So Kilgore, we started out as a bricks and mortar used book and independent comic shop in Denver, Colorado, 10 years ago. And about 8 years ago, we started publishing comics. And the sort of short version of that story is that we were, Noah Van Sciver was a Denver cartoonist at the time, and he would come in with his comics and ask us to take them on consignment. And we loved his work, and we sold, crazy numbers of copies of them. But what was happening was we kept saying, we need 5 more copies. And he'd be like, okay, I got to pick up an extra shift so I can, pay for the copies. And it turned out, well, this is insane. It turned out that he was paying more to do the digital printing for his comics than we were paying him for the wholesale rate. Shops usually pay about 50% of the cover price. So, his books cost $4, so we paid him $2, but he was paying like $2.75 to print up each issue. So he was actually losing money every time he printed a comic. And he's such a good guy and such a talented artist that we sort of said, well, why don't we just help you out? Why don't we do it? And that's sort of how we got into publishing. And then I guess about 4 or 5 years ago now, we sort of spun the publishing arm off with me. I moved to the DC area for a set of reasons, and kind of brought the publishing stuff with me, and have kind of overseen and facilitated the publishing. So Kilgore still exists as a great shop in Denver. It's run by a good friend of mine named John Kubler, and then I sort of run the publishing arm of it, based here in College Park, Maryland. So that's a little bit of our kind of funny story. In terms of our mission, I mean, that Noah story is kind of the blueprint for what we want to do, which is there are just so many great cartoonists right now who are doing really interesting, really valid, really exciting work in the comics medium, but there just isn't unfortunately, a lot of comic shops don't stock self-produced or handmade DIY pamphlet type things. There's a number of really great shops that do, obviously, and those are deluged with really quality work from people. So our mission is to sort of find those cartoonists that we really think have a great vision and are implementing that vision and are working hard within the independent comics community, and to try to give them a little bit of a leg up. The hope is that by offering professionally printed books, and by offering a few other distribution mechanisms, and making sure they have enough copies in print so that they can spend their time on their artwork or going to shows to meet readers and sort of offer their work to the public, it kind of takes a little bit of a load off of them, while at the same time giving them a little bit more exposure. And so I think one of our artists is a really good example of that, Tom Van Deusen. We're about to do our third book with Tom, and he actually interned at Fantagraphics a few years ago. And every time we do a new book with Fantagraphics, I get in touch with my buddies at Fanta, and I'm like, when are you going to steal Tom? When are you going to steal Tom away from me? You got to put out a book with this guy. And that really is our hope. Is kind of like the Noah path. Noah was self-publishing, and then we were able to provide him like the next rung on the ladder, and then he went on and has worked with a number of other much larger publishers who can get into Barnes and Noble and the other places that we might not be able to get into. So. So that's a little bit about our kind of mission. We're really an artist-friendly and artist-focused micro press. And in terms of the types of stories we look for, it's a little bit all over the place, but generally we love humor comics. We love sort of what I think of as literary comics, sort of in the short story vein. And then we love historical comics. We've done a couple really good historical comics. And then obviously a lot of autobiographical stuff. But we tend to... there are a lot of avenues for people who are doing more, speculative fiction or science fiction or fantasy or different things like that. And that's not our niche, which is fine. It's great that there's venues for that. Our niche is more in the literary is probably the best way to sum it up.
Yeah. Let me throw in right here that I am amazed at the number of connections that Noah Van Sciver has to many of the creators and publishers that we have on the Comics Alternative. A couple of months ago, I was talking with Joseph Remnant about his new book, Cartoon Cloud, and he was telling me that one of the ways that he really got started, or when he was like first getting started in comics, both he and Noah had a website, and that's where they were publishing a lot of their stuff at first.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. They had a great website, and in fact, actually, Noah is almost a de facto talent scout for us. He introduced me to Joseph at an SPX a number of years ago, right when they were starting that website, and that led to us putting out Joseph's book, Blind Spot #3. Mm-hmm. His first two issues of Blind Spot were self-published, and they're excellent and really great storytelling. So we were psyched to put out his third issue of that. But yeah, he's that ethos that Noah has, he really views it as a community, and he views comics as a way to kind of make connections with people who ask similar questions and look at the world, in a similar way. And And we've always been impressed with his work ethic. He's cranking out work all the time, and he's a really vibrant member of the community in a lot of ways. So yeah, he's a good. We sort of honestly we lucked out with him as our first cartoonist. If we had maybe someone else who wasn't quite as committed or dedicated, who knows? It might have been well, we published this comic and that's it. But it really helped to kick our butts to do a really good job. So.
Well, tell me more about this particular Kickstarter campaign that you started just the other week. Now, this is for all of your 2018 releases?
Yep, that's right. Yeah. So I always try to do all the books at once, mostly because we can save on shipping and we get discounts on printing and that kind of thing. We had thought about doing this sort of subscription thing where you get a book or two a month, but the reality is I don't make any money from Kilgore, and so I have to be able to kind of laser-like focus on it for a couple months of the year, and then the rest of the time I've got the rest of my life that I work with. So we try to do it all at once, and I can kind of just run through the books if that would be
sure
helpful. So in every time I talk about these books, by the way, I feel badly with the ordering of them because I'm like, well, they're all phenomenal books, and I think that's the thing that stands out to me about this lineup is that somehow we really lucked into nine just incredible comics that we're super excited about. So the first one I would talk about is Baseline Blvd, which is from Emi Gennis, and we published her book The Plunge in a previous campaign. She's a comics professor in Columbus and is just a really talented cartoonist. She does a lot of historical comics. This comic, however, is autobiographical, 64 pages, saddle stitch. It's mostly wordless, and it sort of describes this drive she took from her hometown in Kansas to a cemetery. And it's just a beautiful, tragic, sort of fragile story that is, I think, extremely powerful. She had self-published it a few years ago, and it was that book that made me reach out to her and say, hey, whatever you've got next, we want to do. And that's how we ended up doing The Plunge with her. And then for this campaign, I was thinking a lot about how this story fits in really well with the other books we're doing and really deserves a wider audience. And so we're really excited to give it a slightly bigger release. The second book is Tinderella from MS Harkness, and she is a relatively new cartoonist. She is from Minneapolis, and she's been studying at MCAD with Kevin Huizinga and Zach Sally. And her book, Tinderella, is a full-length graphic novel. It's about 150 pages, 156, I think. And it details, it's autobiographical from a time a few years ago when she was sort of young and trying to figure out like being a cartoonist and have a dating life and have a personal life and just how to balance all those things. And it's just a really powerful, really personal story that I think it just jumped out at me. And she's someone, this is kind of great, she just sort of harangued me at conventions for about a year, and just came up to the table and said, you got to, I've got a book for you, I've got a book for you, I've got a book for you. And when she finally gave me the galley for it, I'm embarrassed to say it sort of sat on my desk for a little bit. And then when I get books like that, I always have to get up at like 4 or 5 in the morning before my family gets up so I can like read all the submissions. And so I read it and I was just floored. I mean, and I emailed her immediately. I was like, hey, let's talk at the next SPX. And then we kind of hooked it up. The next book is Tommy Time from Tom Van Deusen. And Tom does these great, I mean, I think you've probably read some of his other stuff, but just these irreverent comics. And it's really, I think, important right now. He sort of does this character, Tom Van Deusen, who is the worst possible person. That's the only way to describe it. He's just an awful human being. And I think in this moment in our history, it's really fun to have a comic book that's about like, 30-something, straight white dude who's just a clod and always kind of gets it in the end. It has that old timey cartoon feel, where the anvil falls on the guy's head or whatever, for being such a oaf. And so Tom's stories, I think, are hilarious, screamingly funny comics. And it's, I think it makes you feel good because you're like, yeah, he gets it. And I don't mean he gets it as in he understands it. I mean, he gets a sock to the jaw. So, and that's a pamphlet comic that'll be 32 pages. Our next book is by far the biggest thing we've ever done. It's called Monkey Chef. It's by a guy named Mike Freiheit. And Mike's a Chicago-based cartoonist and illustrator, and he helps to organize the Cake Comics Festival and some of the comic stuff in Chicago. And this one is 240 pages, full color, and it details the time where he lived in Africa as a chef for monkeys. I mean, he worked at a primate preserve and was literally cooked all the food for the monkeys. And it kind of deals with like homesickness, being away from home. It deals with body image issues, toxic masculinity, and then just the natural world. It's a very powerful, wonderful story. And Mike's another guy too, who, every time I'd see him at a show, he'd be like, "Hey, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think?" Over time, it totally made sense to do it. The next book we have is a new Blammo from Noah. And I just got all the files from that the other day and read through it, and it really is incredible. It's 44 pages. It's going to be full color pamphlet comic, and it kind of interweaves a few different stories. One is this great historical story about a guy named Artemus Ward, who is sort of America's first stand-up comedian. He was Abraham Lincoln's favorite writer, and was good friends with Mark Twain, and just had this great sardonic approach to life, but is largely forgotten. I think very few people know Artemus Ward, and Noah kind of uses that story as a bit of a touchstone, I think, for the rest of his autobiographical stories that are throughout the book. Next up is a book called Angloid from Alex Graham, and she's a Seattle-based cartoonist, although she did a lot of this book when she was living in Denver. And I think this is a really special book. It's 156 pages as well. And it's autobiographical, but very surreal, I think. And I always kind of describe it as her work is very much like the 60s underground stuff, but without the hyper masculinity and the focus on, giant phalluses. And you know what I mean? Like that some of that stuff is just unreadable because you're like, come on, just tell me a story. And that's what she does. So she's able to really get at some, I think, interesting questions and, what's the role of art in life? What's the role of life in life? It's I think a really special book. She serialized it in her series Cosmic Being, although the last big batch of pages will be unique to this graphic novel. And I think she self-published maybe like 20 copies of her when I was like, "Hey, let's do it," and she was like, "Great, I'll stop printing them." So, so that's kind of fun. The next book is September 12th from Robert Sergel, and Robert is a guy who maybe a year and a half ago I was feeling personally pretty like bummed out about comics. I felt like I hadn't really read anything new or interesting or good in a while. And on a whim, I had ordered a bunch of Robert's books, Eschew and Bald Knobber, which I think are both on Secret Acres. And they arrived right before I was going to some comics fest, and I read them on the plane, and it just knocked me down. These incredible stories. His style, I think, is a lot like Nick Dranasso. It's got this very clinical style to it.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, and his stories are, generally, kind of darker, a little more sardonic. And this book is a lot more political. At least a little bit of it deals with the sort of fallout right after September 11th, and it's a really fun book. It's going to be 7 by 7, so it'll be a square book, and it'll be I think this one's either 32 or 36 pages. And then next up is Lawns from Alex Nall. And Alex, he's like one of my favorite guys working in comics. I can't get enough of this guy. He did a book a couple years ago called Teaching Comics. He's an art teacher, a high school art teacher. And then last year he self-published his book on Mr. Rogers called Let Some Word That Is Heard Be Yours, which is I thought an excellent take on a biography, because it's almost like a personal biography of this person, Mr. Rogers. And his book Lawns is going to be about 100 pages, and it's the story of this small town where there's an election coming up, and just kind of it's just sort of a good story about the suspicion and intrigue and, bad feelings that can exist in a small town. And I think, again, at our point in time is probably going to be a pretty good read. And then our last book is sort of a to be determined, but another person that I kind of fell in love with and got in touch with this year is Inés Estrada. And I picked up her collection called Impatience, and her work is just phenomenal. She is from Mexico, although she lives in San Antonio now. And she's in her mid-20s, I think, and just does these like beautiful sort of kind of freaky comics. The only way I can describe them. Some are really surreal, some are really beautiful, some are really tender, some are really crazy. And so I reached out to her and said, hey, we'd love to do a book with you. And she said, I've got this 32-page thing I'm working on. Would you be into it? I said, great. And so we're going to do that book with her. Tentatively, the story is a woman who's given 6 months to live, and so then becomes a thief, so that she can make her way to Iceland, which I think, I haven't read a single page of it, but I'm ecstatic about it. So so those are the 9 books we've got coming up. I don't know if you have questions. I'd be happy to chat more about any of them.
Well, one of the things I'd like to know, and I'm sure that our listeners would as well, are the various reward levels that you're offering. And looking on your Kickstarter page, there are a lot, many of which include original art, and also things that aren't necessarily a part of the Kickstarter campaign. But I guess, tell me about some of the core reward levels. Like if people wanted to get all of the books that are coming out in 2018, or just some of them, or even focusing on a particular creator, what kind of levels do you have?
Yeah, I mean, we try to do everything sort of across the board. Let's see, if I'm looking at it right now, I think we have things as low as $6 for some of our individual pamphlet comics, and then we have rewards that go all the way up to $265. So we're priced for just about every budget. And the way I look at Kickstarter is very much as a pre-order mechanism. And we could probably chat for several days about this, but distribution within the micro press and the small press community is a legitimate problem. Primarily the way you sell books is at a show or online. And the truth is, if you go to a show and you sell 30 or 40 books, that's a pretty good show. And so most times you're kind of breaking even. You're not really, making the money that you need to support the artist and support the printing costs and that kind of thing. And similarly with online sales, you might sell, a handful of books a week. But with Kickstarter, every time I do a Kickstarter, I'm able to literally sell 2,000 books. And we're able to pay all the royalties for all of our artists up front. So as soon as the money comes in from Kickstarter, I send money out to all the artists. And that I think is pretty special and pretty unique. And so with that in mind, I try to make the reward levels literally as open and easy to use as a potential backer would want them to be. So we've actually had one of the reasons we have so many levels is I've had a lot of people say, oh, I really want this Tom Van Deusen book, but I kind of want to check out the Inés book. And I'm like, great, I'll just create a reward level that's those 2 books. And so it's almost a la carte. And so if anyone wants something that's not there, let me know and I'll make it there. Because I'd rather
tailor-made campaign.
Well, no, because the truth is that, if you live in Ames, Iowa, there may not be a comic shop that's going to carry Baseline Boulevard and, Tinderella. And so you might think I'd love those books. It's not a reward level. I'll see if my shop gets it. The shop never gets it. And then you never actually see the work. And our number one priority is to get the work from artists we love in front of more readers. And so any way I can make that easier, I'm happy to. That being said, we've done a bunch of books with Tom Van Deusen. We've done a bunch of books with Noah Van Sciver. So we do have kind of packs for those. Tom was kind enough to create a new t-shirt design for this campaign that is shockingly tasteful for Tom standards. And so if people want to get the new Kilgore shirt, I screen print all, I burn the screen and I print them all on my kitchen table, and my 5 and 3-year-olds usually help me pull the ink and I do the ironing and stuff. So it's a family affair.
So they're made with love.
They're made with a lot of love. That is definitely true. And my kids love helping me pack orders on Kickstarter too. They fight over who gets to go, peel the shipping label off. So it really is pretty fun. But yeah, so we've got, sort of packages if you're really into Tom, if you're really into Noah, and then Alex Nall, he's offered up some of his previous books to be included in sort of an Alex Nall package. And there's, we've got a couple things from Alex Graham, so it's basically anything. If any of this stuff is interesting, come check it out. And if you don't quite see what you're after, let me know and we can figure it out. We've also started doing digital copies. We just did that for the first time on our last campaign. And that turns out to be a pretty positive option too, particularly for international. That it's a shame, but shipping 1,000 pages of books to Finland, for example, can cost, $80. And so people are paying, $80 for the books and $80 for shipping. And that's a deterrent. But if you pay, I think it's $35, you can get all the PDFs of all the books. So, so we try to make it as user-friendly as possible.
Yeah. So if people go to Kickstarter and do a search for Kilgore Books, then they can quickly, easily find the various reward levels that you were describing. And you're right. I mean, there is something for everyone. You can order a la carte. You can tailor your choices to a particular creator or series of books. I mean, one of the things that if people want to get a taste of everything that you're publishing this year, then they can back what you're calling the full 2018 run at $89. And that's all the books, right?
Yep, that's all the books. And then you can also there's an option for all the floppies, the pamphlet comics, and there's an option for just the graphic novels if you're more into, kind of bigger novels. And then we also have a lot of reward levels that include our back catalog because we've put out, 3 dozen comics so far. And so, if you want to pick up some of our back stuff to check out, and I try to discount those a little bit. So it's like you save a couple bucks on what they would normally cost. And, Mike Freiheit, he's offered up a couple of his self-printed things for a little Mike Freiheit pack. And so we really had to make it extremely user-friendly.
Mm-hmm. Now, the deadline for backing your current Kickstarter campaign is Friday, March 30th at 7:50 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So again, that's Friday, March 30th at 7:50 a.m. Make sure you head over to Kickstarter and you search for Kilgore Books, and you actually back this before the morning of March 30th.
Yeah, that would be great. We're definitely it's our biggest lineup yet, and as such, we're asking for more money than we have ever before in the past. So we're it looks like we're going to fund. Everything's on a good trajectory, but anyone who's ever run a Kickstarter can tell you you're just constantly hitting refresh on your phone, for essentially a month straight. And I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, if we don't raise the money, these books won't get printed. That's one of the roles of the micro press is that we're doing the stuff that some of the bigger guys can't or don't want to do. And so if you want to see some comics you're not going to see otherwise, this is the way to do it.
Listeners, it is your responsibility. Okay. If this does not fund, it is all your fault.
I'm gonna come and talk to each and every one of you with my 2 children.
yeah, that'll do it. This is wonderful. And, I always see you whenever I go to Small Press Expo. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go last year, but I do plan on going this year. So
great.
I look forward to talking with you, hanging out at the Kilgore table. And who knows, maybe later this year, we could do another publisher spotlight on your 2018 output.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd love it. Oh, and I'm sorry, Derek, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that all of these books are slated to debut at the Cake Comics Festival in June, early June in Chicago. And then all of them. Well, yeah, because we're going to get them all printed at once, and then I'll just show up with a bunch of boxes. And then everything will ship out to backers right after that. So as soon as I'm back from Cake, the month of June is going to be dedicated to shipping. So everyone should get everything by early July.
Okay, that's great to know, because I was wondering if you're going to stagger the release of these various books, like, spring, summer, and then fall. But so people who back this campaign should expect to get everything by the middle of the summer.
Yep. The one catch would be Inés is still working on her. Everyone else is basically done, but Inés is working on her book. So if it hits a snag, we might just send that one out, a month later. But we've fulfilled every pledge I think we've ever gotten. So.
Yeah. Well, again, I encourage everyone listening to this to check out your Kickstarter campaign for Kilgore Books. Again, go to Kickstarter, do a search for Kilgore Books and Comics 2018 releases, and you'll find that you can back this at a variety of reward levels, but make sure that you do it before March 30th at 7:50 a.m. And if people want to find out more about Kilgore Books, they can go to your website, which is kilgorebooks.com, correct?
Yep, that's it.
Yes. Dan, it's always great talking with you and
always
talking with you, especially for the podcast. Good luck with everything. And if not before, I hope to see you in September.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Derek.
Sure. And I will be back next Saturday for another comics-related Kickstarter. Until then, have a nice weekend.